So this video has not turned out the way I'd originally planned for it to. And I mean that in the best way possible. Watercolors are a medium that has always eluded me. They have no substance and they like to do their own thing. And this week, I've had to come to the painful conclusion that I might in fact be a control freak that likes her paints to work a certain way. So you're not just gonna watch me have a skills upgrade today, you're gonna watch me grow as a person. This week, we're attempting digital watercolor painting in Krita, and boy oh boy has it been a journey. One of patience, self-control, and conscious, attentive painting. We'll dive into the brushes I used, how I preserved the watercolor paper texture, why it was an underlay and not an overlay that actually worked best, and more importantly, why I decided to go with not one, but two separate paintings for this video. So without much further ado, here's an experiment in digital watercolor painting with Krita. So for this video, I spent some time testing a whole bunch of watercolor brushes for Krita until I settled for like one or two brushes from 5 separate brush packs. I didn't really end up using all of these, but I have linked the packs down in the description anyway, so you can check them out. The brushes I ended up grabbing weren't just textured tips with textured brush strokes. The ones I actually loved had dynamic texture. What that means is the more you paint, the more the first few pixels of color seem to sort of fade into the paper texture that's embedded into these brushes. So while the Krita base bundle and the Jack Pack brushes were mostly just a textured tip and a textured paint with low opacity, they were just continuous stamps. However, when we test the Pessy watercolor pack, we kind of see the gradual lightening effect. Like, do you see how when I paint with more pressure, the central area seems to be a lot lighter, as if the brush is leaving a lot more water, pushing all the pigment to the edges? That was a cool effect, but I don't think I ended up using it very much. The brush I did fall in love with was this square one from the Rakuri brush kit. It's called the Aqua Pastel, and do you see how the more I paint with it, the more the texture shows through on the first few brush marks? It's almost like the paint is drying and settling into the paper underneath. Plus, you know I always prefer a square texture brush over all else, so this one really won me over. The other brush from that kit was a round, much softer version of this. I did add it to my mini folder, but just didn't end up using it at all. And the final brush I grabbed was this one, which is by Grind God on DeviantArt. It's just a stamp brush with a cloudy looking alpha. I thought it would add some nice texture to the piece if I overblend, which we all have a tendency to do. Don't even lie to me right now. But yeah, now that we have our brushes, let's get into the first painting. I say now that this was the first painting, but at the time it was the only painting that I'd planned to do for this video. I'd seen a reel of this one swan who was injured, and then when it was healed and released back into its lake, its mate was waiting there so eagerly and they did like a super cute dancey dance. It was so cute. So I wanted to paint something inspired by that reunion while keeping in mind that we need some simplicity because watercolors are kind of hard to work with if you want super fine detail. I actually did watch a couple of tutorials online, and the first thing everyone does is paste a watercolor paper texture under everything. The idea is to paint pretty much every layer in multiply blend mode so it goes on top of this texture the way that watercolor would. Like, it will maintain that transparency and simulate the texture that we need. So that's the idea I had in mind. At least in the beginning. Well, I say that, I immediately did not do that with the colours, then realised my error and deleted her skin to start over. See, I'm not a watercolour girly. I do not have the patience to gradually build up translucent washes of colour, so with this challenge, I was determined to cultivate that skill. Not just for the sake of the art, but also for life in general. My impatience is the current personal challenge that I feel called to face, so this was a fun exercise. I say fun, I wanted to rip something apart, but that's a me problem. Anyway, with the second attempt at her skin, it was way better because I did actually use the multiply blend mode on both the paint layer and the brush itself. And do you see how lovely that texture is? Okay, so I may have got rid of it again and started over again. Look, this is the process. This is how we learn. The issue was that the brush being on multiply as well as the layer, it was all too dark. So this time I set the brush to normal blend mode, and now this feels right. With this one, I'm pretty sure I gave up on the whole multiply thing and just went straight in to paint the form. With this part though, my big challenge was creating the impression of soft, fluffy feathers without actually rendering with very much opacity at all. I switched back to rendering more of the face, and this is where I started to go completely off script and render this piece like I usually do. I forgot all about transparency and blending modes and just painted it like how I usually would. And the telltale sign is when you can see me layer light tones on top of darker ones. Watercolors don't do that unless you're using like gouache, which we are not. Clearly at this point I had mentally switched off and gone into muscle memory mode. But I wanted to keep these bits in the video because I wanted to share all of it with you. Because guess what? It's all good. Everyone has good days where we are present and focused, and everyone has off days where we are distracted and running on instinct. We just focus on doing the best we can, and that's all I could do here. I do really love how the wing turned out though. It's nice and feathery and fluffy with just the right amount of abstraction. And the shadows that you do see are dark enough to add a sense of layering and definition, but they're still light enough to maintain the softness of it all. Also, at this point, I shared this progress shot with someone who immediately pointed out to me the myth of Zeus, so I had to immediately put clothes on her. Not that that would have mattered with Zeus, but you know. By the end of it, I realized it barely looked like a watercolor painting, so I tried to save it by overlaying another paper texture, which didn't work, and then I tried to put the texture underneath and set the whole painting to multiply on top of it, which seemed to work a lot better. And finally, I added a grain on top. This is the painting that I ended up with. Now, here's the thing about this painting. It is gorgeous, it has those beautiful textures that I was hoping for, and it could very well pass for a watercolor-ish painting. However, like I always say, art is in the process. The finished painting is simply a byproduct. And to be completely honest with you, as I always am, the process of painting this piece felt like the usual. It felt no different to how I usually paint. Sure, I started off with the intent to use blending modes and try to simulate the technique of traditional watercolor painting, but in the end, it felt like the same exact process as I always use, just with different brushes and a texture underlay. And that, to me, didn't feel like I was doing justice to the technique of painting in watercolor. So instead of calling it a day at this point, I decided to dive into a second painting, and this time really give it a proper try to lock in and think about the technique that I use a lot more consciously. Okay, this time around, I decided to keep it super simple and just do a photo study. I realized that one big reason that I kept losing patience with the last piece was that the brushes were slow and glitchy if I made the brush radius very big. So instead of the usual 8K canvas, I went with a 4K by 4K square canvas. Now I don't need massive brushes and they will perform a lot better. I started by pasting the texture in, and this time was determined to only paint using multiply layers. The big shift happened when I realized that due to the transparency of watercolors, I had no choice but to work from light to dark. So I had to make sure that the areas of brightest highlight had little to no paint on them ever. I started with the lightest washes around where the shadows lie, gradually blending into the midtones, not touching the highlights at all. And without meaning to, I somehow ended up with a sepia underpainting, so am I an old master now? The next step was to start to introduce some color. Though the reference has very bronzy tones overall, I put down a little bit of rosiness in her cheek just so it adds a bit of colour variation when we then get the more orangey brown tones on top. I'm gonna be honest, those lips were insanely fun to paint. It was so cool to sort of figure out where the highlights are gonna lie and carefully work around them while gradually building up the shadow. I really freaking love how this looks. I think the big challenge is trying to bear in mind that this is not how the finished piece is going to look. This is when I realized that the way I usually paint is with extreme drama right at the beginning and then gradually soften it out. Turns out I like knowing just how extreme it can get before I add subtleties. Watercolors are the opposite. They start soft, almost like a whisper of wash after wash, and then they gradually build up with little splashes of color. Then they get tighter and more intense until the drama crescendos right at the end. This is why the first piece didn't quite sit right with me. I had the technique entirely backwards. Don't get me wrong, through this entire process, all I wanted to do was throw in the drama already. Like, I couldn't wait for the piece to give what it was supposed to give. But no, Srish, we are here for the slow burn. We want the subtleties of color variation and brush texture to underline the piece and all those tiny intricacies to peek through the layers. Even with the hair that is super dark, it was funny to watch my brain try and work with the idea of building from highlight to shadow, working the texture in from the very beginning, whereas I usually paste the darkest values down, then the highlights and textures at the very end. But once the little areas of build-up were in place, I moved on to global washes. This is where we get to see the face really come to life. This is the bit of classic music where it speeds up and it's like dun 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 dun. But do you see how powerful it looks because of all the underpainting that we've done? This warmth would have been so flat and just boring if we didn't already have the color variations underneath. Finally, I got to go in and add the darkest, sharpest details. So the brows, lashes, flyaway hairs and such. And you guys, I have a confession. I kind of really enjoyed this process. I know it seems blasphemous because I love how I usually paint, but there is something just so enriching about really taking the time to build up a piece nice and slowly, to be conscious and aware and strategic about every brush mark that you make. Like, it just felt so insanely rewarding. You guys have to try it out. Oh my god. And this was digital. Like, can you imagine how much more rewarding it must be to do this traditionally and actually do it right? Like, I've painted with watercolor on paper before, but it's pretty much only ever left me frustrated and anxious about making a wrong move. But you know what? I might have to give it a proper go with a more mindful approach. It might be different this time. God, I sound like someone trying to get back with their toxic ex because he's definitely changed this time. Don't do it, girl. He'll never change. Alright, I then kind of got carried away because I remembered that my own brush pack has these insanely cool rainbow brushes and yeah, I kind of ran with it. But do you see how cool that glitchy effect is? I love every single thing about the finished piece, but more importantly than that, I really loved every single part of the process. You guys, I may have to do way more digital watercolor pieces in the future. What do you think? And now I finally feel satisfied. I feel like I did justice to the technique, and quite frankly, I may have fallen in love with the idea of painting digitally in watercolors a little bit. But what do you think? Do you think I should explore this medium a lot more? Do you think I did it justice? Sound off in the comments. I have linked all the brushes that I used that weren't in the Krita default bundle. I've linked them all in the description, so make sure you check them out and give them a go yourself. And if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, make sure to let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribing to my channel for even more art content. I always have links to my social media in the description as well. And if you like what I do and would like to grab even more art stuff that I put out every single week, you can check out my Patreon for things like the complete speed paints from start to finish, my custom brush kit that I made from scratch for both Krita and Photoshop, the step-by-step PDFs for all my paintings, early access to all of my paintings in 4K and 8K quality, as well as the complete collection of my real-time art and chill paint along style tutorials. It is all up on Patreon, and your support on there allows me to keep making all this content for free for YouTube. So I will leave a link up here in the cards and in the description, and thank you so much for checking it out. Alrighty, you guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you're curious about other traditional painting mediums in Krita, there is a video I did a long time ago about experimenting with digital oils in Krita. So I'll leave that video here. It was really interesting and I think you'll love it. So check that out down here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!